So this afternoon, we're going to do Gardening 101. So we're going to cover the basics of how to get a garden started, some of the things we need to think about when we're doing that. So here's kind of what we're going to cover. So we're going to talk about the environment, the different things that the plants need to grow successfully. We're going to talk about making a plan for a garden. Again, things you need to consider, layout, how you're going to set it up, everything like that. Talk some about plant selection. Again, what you should look at when you're thinking about what plants to grow. How to get a garden ready to plant. So going into that garden preparation, stuff like that. And we'll briefly cover some basic pest management um, on well, some basic pest management that you can do in the garden. So first off, light. It's probably probably the most important thing that we're going to need to consider when it comes to our plants. So light is essential for growing our plants. So light equals photosynthesis. We don't have light, plants aren't going to be able to photosynthesize, and they're not going to last very long. So again, remember back to your high school biology. Plants are going to take that carbon dioxide and some water, use that energy from sunlight, and they're going to convert that into glucose and oxygen. And we're looking at light levels. Um, it's important to think about what kind of light levels your plants are going to need. Some plants are going to need full sun, so 6, 8, 10 hours of sun a day. Others are going to require shade conditions. They're not going to be able to. Some may not be able to handle direct full sun. So then when it comes to some of our shade plants, if they get full sun, they'll get burned up. So again, you kind of have to think about what plants you're going to be planting and where you need to put them. And light levels will change in our landscape over time. So we have daily changes as the sun travels across the sky. It may encounter different obstacles depending on where it is in the sky. Light intensity is going to change throughout the day. The sunlight's going to be less intense in the morning and in the evening compared to middle of the day. As trees and other plants in our landscapes grow, that can affect the amount of light an area is going to get. So you may plant a garden in full sun, but there's a tree nearby, and in 10, 15 years, that garden area is now shaded. So you need to think about um, what plants in the area are going to look like down the road. Are they going to shade out a particular area? And then seasonally, light intensity and light levels are going to change over time. Um, as as we go on through the spring and into the summer, our days will be getting longer. And then as we start going into late summer and fall, days get shorter, light intensity decreases. So just some other things to keep in mind when you're placing a garden. Soil, again, is probably going to be the second most important thing when it comes to our gardens. So the soil is going to provide our plants with nutrients. They're also going to get their water from the soil, air. So plant roots need air too. If you have waterlogged soils, there's not going to be any air in there. And most plants are not going to be able to tolerate that and they're going to die. Soil is also going to serve as an anchor for the plants, going to keep them in the ground. So depending on what type of soil you have, it's going to affect how often you need to irrigate. If you have a real heavy clay soil, that's going to hold water a lot better than a sandy soil is, which you're going to have to water more frequently. Um, Type of soil you have is also going to depend. Can The amount of nutrients in the soil can also vary depending on the type of soil you have. So again, if you have a nice black soil like we do in most of Illinois, there's probably going to be some pretty good nutrient levels in there. You may not have to do much fertilizing, whereas if you have sandier soils, they're not going to have typically going to have as many nutrients available in the soil to plants, so you're probably going to have to fertilize more often with a sandier soil. Soil is going to be made up of three mineral particles. So you have sand, these are the largest particles, followed by silt, and then clay, which are going to be very fine particles in that soil. And the soil type you have is going to be dependent on the amount of clay, silt, and sand you have in there. And those different particles are going to kind of affect how much air, water, and nutrients are available to the plant. So if you look at that picture on the bottom right there, you can see those clay particles. Those are real small. They can pack in real tightly together, so they're going to hold on to more water. They're going to hold on to nutrients a lot more than a sandier soil is, which is going to have more of that pore space. Sandy soils are going to have more air in them, but they're not going to be able to hold as much water and nutrients as soil with a lot of clay in it. Organic matter is also another important component of our soil. So organic matter is going to be made up of the living microbes in the soil, that bacteria, fungus, stuff like that, the partially decayed plant material, and those microbes. So as plants start to break down, as that fungus and bacteria starts to break down, that's will make up some of that organic matter as well. And then we have our humus. This is going to be that stable material that's formed when that plant material and those microbes have fully broken down. And organic matter is going to release nutrients slowly as it's broken down. So it's kind of think of it as kind of a slow release fertilizer. It's going to slowly release nutrients to our plants that they can then take up. Organic matter, if you have real heavy soils, can help loosen up that soil, increase the pore space so it's not quite as waterlogged, make it a little bit better for plant growth. If you have a real sandy soil, it can help aggregate some of those sand particles, make it clump a little better and help with that water retention and nutrient retention in that soil. And also, as it's creating these little aggregates, it can help lessen soil compaction in a lot of our soils as well. So if you're starting a garden, one thing you probably want to do is do a soil test. By doing a soil test, one, you're going to be able to see what the pH of your soil is. Certain plants require different pH levels. Right here on the graphic, you can see most plants kind of like the pH between 6.1, 6.9, most of our garden plants, particularly our vegetable crops, stuff like that, kind of like that 6.1 to 6.9. But if you're looking at stuff like blueberries, rhododendron, stuff like that, they like more acidic soils. So if you're going to be planting stuff like that, you probably want to do a soil test to make sure your soil is acidic enough. And if it's not, you're going to have to um, add some stuff to your soil to reduce that pH. And it's also going to help you give an idea of what your nutrient levels are like in that soil. So do you need to fertilize? If you're deficient in anything, you're going to need to add that. If you have nutrient levels that are real high, you may not want to add any fertilizers to that because you can actually get too much of some of these nutrients in the soil can actually become toxic to plants. When it comes to taking soil samples, really you can take these any time of the year as long as the ground isn't frozen. You can take a soil sample. Late summer and fall are kind of the ideal times. That way, if you have to add any amendments to the soil, particularly if you're trying to alter that pH, it gives that stuff a little time to work. That can take a couple of months sometimes. So if you do that in the fall, by the time spring rolls around again, kind of everything's worked in and you've kind of corrected some of your issues with the soil. So how do you go about taking a sample? Pretty easy process. So you get a bucket and something to dig with. Keep in mind if the soil is too wet to work, it's too wet to sample. So if you can go out, kind of make a ball with your soil. If it kind of holds its shape, that soil is probably going to be too wet. If it starts to crumble, more than likely it's going to be dry enough that you can go out there and test or kind of work the soil. Taking a soil sample, if this is going to be a new garden area where you have turf or other plants growing, you want to remove all that turf, other plant debris, residue, stuff like that. So you have a bare soil surface that you're going to be sampling from. You want to dig down a little bit, 3-4 inches, maybe a little deeper if you're doing more trees or perennial type stuff. Take a small sample of that hole you dug, and you want to do this randomly throughout the garden. You don't want to just take one sample for a garden. You want to take multiple samples from there. You combine all of those samples, mix them up, and then you take a scoop of that mixed soil, and that's what you're going to send off to the soil lab. There's a link here for the Illinois Soil Testing Association, soiltesting.org. They have a list of labs that will test your soil for you. If you're going to be doing this and you haven't done it before, you probably want to look for a lab that's going to take home samples and also is going to provide an interpretation with those results, so um, how much of a fertilizer and stuff you need to add to that. If you don't get an interpretation, you can contact your local extension office, and somebody there can help you read that. So if you're new to gardening and you haven't started one, I would encourage you to take a soil sample before you get too far into the process. Another thing to consider when it comes to creating a garden is to think about the exposure your plants are going to have. So if you live kind of out in the country where we have real strong winds, a lot of times the soils are going to dry out a little faster, so you're going to have to water a little more often. So maybe if you have a windbreak or something that you can utilize, kind of help reduce those winds, that could be helpful. Reflective heat. So if you're planting near a sidewalk, a driveway, or a house, those surfaces can reflect heat off of them. They can also absorb heat, and kind of release that into the evening and night, so those areas cool down a lot slower. That is something to consider. Some plants may not like that extra heat and may not thrive in those conditions. Another thing to think about is where is kind of the low areas in a landscape. A lot of times frost is going to settle in that. So those areas are going to be more susceptible to late spring and early fall frosts. So it's probably an area you want to avoid for a vegetable garden. Um, it could greatly reduce the amount of time you have to grow um, your crops if you're doing it in a low area. Another thing, kind of how the environment affects this, is going to be the hardiness of plants. So certain plants are going to be able to tolerate colder temperatures better than others when it comes to a vegetable garden. So we've got stuff like our hardy vegetables that can take a frost. They can take temperatures down into the 20s. Um, they may get a little damage, but they're not going to be killed. So stuff like broccoli, cabbage, spinach um, are kind of our early season crops that can handle that. We have our hardy vegetables are our frost tolerant, so you can plant these a couple weeks before our kind of average last frost date. So cauliflower, carrots, beets, stuff like that. They can't take a real hard frost, but they can tolerate light frost and still survive. A little later in the year, we get into our tender vegetables. Typically, we plant these around our average last frost or median last frost, or a week or two later. So stuff like beans, sweet corns, stuff like that. These plants, if they get a frost, are going to be damaged. So if you plant them and a frost is predicted, you're probably going to have to go out and cover them or protect them in some way so you don't get any damage to them. And then we have our very tender or our warm-loving vegetables. These plants, a lot of times, if they get any kind of frost, they're going to be killed. And they need warmer soils in order to really thrive. So typically we're doing this 3-4 weeks after, planting these 3-4 weeks after our median frost dates. So a lot of our cucurbit crops, cucumbers, squash, melons, peppers, eggplants would fit into that category as well. So when exactly is your kind of your last frost? So here in Jacksonville, where I'm at, um, you can see down here, our median last frost date is going to be April 19th. So we've kind of passed that date already. But keep in mind there's still a 50-50 chance you're going to get a frost hill. So we're not out of the woods yet, so to speak. Here in Jacksonville, kind of the latest frost we've had is May 17th. So we would kind of consider our frost-free date May 17th, and that's probably when we would want to look at planting our really tender type vegetables. And that's going to vary depending on where you're at in the state. This may be a little hard to see depending on what kind of screen you're using, but if you go to the Illinois State Climatologist website, you can access this map there. One map I didn't include in this presentation, and I probably should have, is the USDA hardiness zones. This is more important for perennial plants, so a lot of our flowers, our trees, stuff like that. And this map kind of shows you the average extreme low for an area. So for Illinois, kind of the northwest corner, we're in a 5A zone. Then kind of the northern Illinois down to Springfield is 5B. Springfield south is going to be a 6A, and the very southern tip of Illinois is going to be getting close to 7. So kind of depending on where you're at in the state, if you're going to be planting perennial plants, you want to look at those USDA hardiness zones and make sure you're not planting a plant where it's not going to be able to tolerate the real cold winters we have, depending on where you are in the state. So those are just kind of the basics, some of the things to consider when you're looking at placing a garden. Before you actually start your garden, it's a good idea to make a plan. So again, where are you going to put your garden? What kind of garden are you going to create? Are you going to build? Are you going to do this in the ground? Are you going to build raised beds? What type of plants are you going to be growing in there? For this presentation, I'm going to focus on vegetable crops. So my examples are going to be for vegetables, but all this information is still going to apply if you're doing fruit, or if you're doing more ornamental annuals and perennials, stuff like that. How big is your garden going to be? Again, for those vegetable crops, how, how much space do you have to put a garden in? And how much time do you have to devote to maintaining this garden? And what are you going to grow? There's another thing you need to take into consideration. The size of your garden may affect what kind of plants you're able to grow, and vice versa. So where should my garden grow? Again, for vegetables, we're going to need a minimum of 6 hours of direct sun a day. Ideally, we're going to have more like 8 to 10 hours of direct sunlight. Um, our vegetables that are creating a fruit, so our tomatoes, our peppers, our squash, our cucurbic crops, they need a lot of sun. Some of our leafy greens, our lettuce, spinach, some of our herbs, they can tolerate a little less, some less sun. So if you're kind of more that 6 hour sun, some of our fruiting vegetables may struggle a little bit, but our leafy greens should do all right. We want to have good soil and good drainage. So if you've got an area in your yard where you get some rainfall and water, the soil gets kind of soggy, it's probably not a good place to put a vegetable garden. Pretty much all of our vegetable crops do not like having wet feet, and they're going to struggle in there if you're doing that in the ground, or you may have to look at raised beds or something like that. You want to have it close to a water supply. You really don't want to be dragging hoses and carrying buckets out to water your garden. You want to try to avoid trees and shrubs. Not only are they going to shade your garden, they're also going to compete for water and nutrients with your vegetable crops as well. Ideally, again, kind of that flat or gently sloping areas, we don't want that. In low spots, again, that cold air kind of settles down there, so we get earlier frosts and early frost later in the year, and late frost early in the year. And again, kind of close to the house. The closer it is to the house, the more often you see it. If you kind of place it back in the yard, kind of out of sight, out of mind, you're probably a little more likely to kind of ignore it and forget about it. If it's right there, you're constantly seeing it, you're going to be a little more likely to take care of that a little bit better. So when it comes to garden layout, so again, how big is it going to be? How much do you want to grow? Are you growing for one person? Or are you growing for 5 or 6 people? One thing to consider. Keep in mind that the bigger the garden is, that you're going to have to spend more time maintaining that and taking care of that garden. So if you're new to gardening, you haven't done a vegetable garden before, if you remember nothing else from this presentation, is start small, and then you can kind of expand over time. You go too big too quickly, you kind of get in over your head, and a lot of times people just kind of give up. So start small and kind of build from there. And again, what do you want to grow? Again, that may dictate how big your garden needs to be. So what type of garden are you going to use? So there's several different options here. So we have our traditional or in-ground garden. So that's that picture on the top right there. Our raised beds are another option. So those two pictures on the bottom left. We have our container gardens. These don't have to just be pots. You can see in this picture here, they've got 5-gallon buckets and storage containers that they're using. So again, a variety of different options there. And then straw-bale gardens. These have become more popular the last several years. So we'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages of each of these types of gardens. So we've got our traditional, again, that in-ground garden. So the advantages to this is that we are using our existing soil. So a lot of times there's not going to be much cost in getting these started. The soil is already there. Basically, you just need to clear that ground and you can get started a lot of times. Again, there's that less startup work, clear the ground, and you're ready to plant. Depending on what's growing there, that may be easier, and there's several different ways you can clear that ground. But again, compared to some of these others, a lot less startup work. Because this is in the ground, a lot of times these gardens can be quite large. You can make these larger depending on your space availability. So this allows for room for wandering plants. So again, our cucurbits, our pumpkins, our squash, our watermelons, cucumbers, some of these plants that take up a lot of room, this is probably the type of garden that you want to have if you're going to try to grow some of those plants. And these are going to in-ground beds are going to have lower water requirements compared to our other types of gardens because they can kind of draw off that water reserve in the rest of the landscape. There's a little more water holding capacity in the ground compared to some of these other types. There are some disadvantages though. Typically, our in-ground beds are going to require more care. There's going to be a lot more weeding. You have that weed seed bank in that soil that's going to be constantly popping up. So you're going to have to spend quite a bit of time weeding and then kind of digging and working that soil. Um, Typically going to have to do more of that as well. Depending on your soil type, the quality of your soil, you may need to be doing some amending. You may need to kind of try to improve the drainage. If you don't have very good nutrient levels after that soil test or the pH is off, again, you're going to have to probably add some amendments to that, adjust that pH, incorporate organic matter, fertilizer, stuff like that to improve the quality of that soil for your plants. It is going to require working at ground level, so depending on how your knees and your back are working, that may not be all that appealing, having to kneel down, squat down to get down on ground level and work on stuff. And because these gardens are typically larger, you can walk through these, so uh, compaction can become an issue as you're walking around in the garden. Our raised beds can allow us to garden in more difficult soil. So if you have poor drainage, um, poor soil quality, if you're in an urban area and you have to worry about contamination or debris in the soil, you can use those raised beds to avoid or get away from some of those issues. A lot of times we're going to have fewer weed problems. A lot of times this is going to depend on the type of soil you're filling those raised beds with, but a lot of times there's going to be fewer weed problems in raised beds compared to in-ground beds. A lot of times you can have a longer growing season. Raised beds are going to dry out and warm up a little more quickly than our in-ground beds, so you can get a kind of a jump start on the growing season a lot of times. Because these raised beds are kind of limited in size, soil compaction and plant damage is going to be greatly reduced because you're not walking through them. And again, they're better drainage because they're raised up. The water is going to drain away a lot faster. And because they're raised up, there's better access to them. Depending on how high you build them, you can greatly reduce the amount of bending and kneeling that you have to do when working with these types of gardens. And it does allow for some material conservation. So if you have cinder blocks, some bricks, stuff like that laying around, you can use those to construct raised beds, leftover lumber, stuff like that. Some disadvantages is that these do have to be constructed. You are going to have to bring in either soil from outside of your landscape or find it somewhere on your landscape to fill these raised beds. So that there's going to be labor involved with that as well as a cost potentially. These are more permanent than some of our other types of gardens. So your in-ground bed, if you get tired of gardening, you just put some grass seed on there and you're done. With the raised beds, you're going to have to deconstruct that or you're just going to have to look at it. Kind of. There are some size limitations. Typically, we don't want to make these wider than 3 or 4 feet. That way you can still reach the middle of the garden from the sides. If you make it much wider than that, you can have difficulty reaching the middle of those beds. And then some plants just don't really do all that well in raised beds. So you think again about some of our cucurbit crops that get quite large. Raised beds may not be the best option because they do need a lot of room to grow. If you do plant them in there, they can quickly take over a raised beds. Other things like sweet corn, where you have to plant blocks of those in order to get proper pollination. Raised beds may not be the best option for growing something like sweet corn as well. Disadvantages, these do drain better, and they also dry out faster. So you're going to have to start watering these a lot sooner than you would with an in-ground bed. There's also our container gardens. So these are good if you have limited space. Say the only space you have that gets good full sun is a deck, a patio, something like that. You can plant in a container and utilize that full sun. Again, little to no weeding in these. Again, you're going to be using potting soil for this. Typically, that should be weed free. Hopefully, the stuff you're getting is weed free. Smaller yields. So again, if you're only growing for one person, a lot of these plants that you're growing in containers are going to be smaller, so the yield is not as high. So you don't have to try to figure out what you're going to do with, hundreds of tomatoes like you would potentially in an in-ground bed. Again, these are smaller, so these can be moved around so they're getting enough sunlight. Again, that kind of that mobile and portable, as long as you don't get too big of a pot. Again, there are some disadvantages. So you have to have that cost of the containers and that potting soil. Again, we're not using our typical garden soil. That stuff is going to be too thick, does not going to drain well enough. There's going to be weed seeds, all kinds of other stuff in there. Their typical garden soil is not going to do well in a container. You're going to want potting soil, which is usually going to be mixture of peat moss, coconut coir, perlite, vermiculite, stuff like that. So a loose, well-draining growing media. They are going to need to be watered more often, particularly when we're hitting the heat of the summer if we're not getting any rain. I've had containers where I've had plants in that I've had to water twice a day just because they dry out so fast, especially if you have large plants in those and you don't have a lot of soil, that soil mix in there to retain some of that moisture. Disadvantage could be smaller yields. Again, depending on your perspective, smaller yields could be a good or a bad thing. And again, you're limited to what you can grow. Again, our larger plants that getting real large, probably are not going to do well in most containers unless you're getting rather large pots. So again, our cucurbits, sweet corn, some of our indeterminate tomatoes are probably going to be too big to grow in most containers. Then we have our straw bale gardens. So again, advantage to this is kind of the easy access. So again, these are up off the ground. So similar to raised beds in that aspect, as well as they're good for areas with, again, with that poor soil. You're not growing in that soil, you're growing in that straw bale. Again, these are a little more mobile. You can place these where there's adequate sunlight. You can place these on a driveway or a sidewalk if need be. Again, there should be minimal or to no weeding if you're using straw bales. And these typically only last about a year, so you don't have to worry about crop rotation. That straw bales are going to break down, and then you can use that as compost or as a mulch in other garden beds. Some disadvantages is that these do require some conditioning in order for you to be able to grow in there. Typically, that's about a 2-week process to get those straw bales properly conditioned for planting. Depending on where you're at in the state, getting straw bales may or may not be an issue. I think you're seeing, as straw bale gardening has become more popular, I think you're seeing straw bales available more readily in a lot of areas. Depending on the size of your straw bale, they can be quite heavy. So depending on your strength, that could be an issue. If you end up with a hay bale, a lot of times those are going to have a lot more seeds in them. So you could have a weed problem if you end up with hay bales. So just keep that in mind. Try to make sure you're getting a straw bale. And again, depending on your perspective, they only last 1 or 2 years, so this could be a disadvantage. So you're going to have to kind of redo these every year or every other year if you're going to go with a straw bale. And these are going to dry out very quickly as well. So these are going to need a lot more watering, a lot more irrigation, especially when we hit the summer if we're not getting adequate rainfall. And there is another Four Seasons presentation that Kelly also did a few years ago that's available on our YouTube page on straw bale gardening if you want more information on how to do on that conditioning process and how all that works. Another thing to consider is water supply. So this is one reason why we typically want to put our vegetable gardens as close to the house as possible. Most of the time that's going to be where our water source is. So you want that close and easily accessible. You don't want to have to go out and start lugging buckets of water out to your garden. You probably don't want to drag a hose out 100 feet to water your garden, because dragging that out and rolling that up frequently is going to get rather old rather quick. So the closer you can get that to your water source, a lot easier it's going to be on you to water your plants. Bunch of different ways we can go about watering. So we can have our spray nozzles, our watering wands, stuff like that. Those are good for pots, kind of smaller areas, maybe straw bales, raised beds, depending on the size. You can do this. If you're having larger gardens, you probably want to look at something more like sprinklers, something like that. Typically, our plants are going to need about 1 inch of water a week. Some may need more than that, but kind of a general rule of thumb is 1 inch of water a week, whether that be from rain or from supplemental irrigation. So kind of keep that in mind. Holding a wand over a plant for 5-10 seconds, you're not giving them enough water. You need to make sure you're giving them enough water that's going to soak down into the soil and get down deep into the soil. So typically, people do not water nearly long enough when they're watering their gardens. One way you can figure that out, if you're using a sprinkler or something, set up some empty tuna fish cans throughout the garden. Let those fill up. Set on your sprinkler. When those fill up, that's usually about 1 inch of water. You know you've watered long enough. So that takes a half hour, that's how long you need to leave your sprinklers on. A disadvantage to this is that you're kind of watering the whole area. You're watering not only kind of your crops, you're watering the weeds. Depending on how large your spray pattern is, you're watering the grass. So you're wasting a lot of water. You're getting the leaves wet, which can lead to disease issues potentially. So there are some disadvantages to using this. Another way you can irrigate is through drip irrigation. So the advantages to drip irrigation is that you can kind of target that water directly to your plants. So you're using a lot less water, a lot less wasted water in that. Um, a lot less evaporation because this is going directly to the soil. It's not getting on the leaves and evaporating off. This can be rather low maintenance once you get it set up. You can also set these up on a timer um, so that the water turns on and waters for however long you need it to, and then kicks off. You don't have to go out there and manually set it up. Disadvantages though is that you do have to set these up. There is some cost associated with that. You can get something like a soaker hose on that bottom left, and you can kind of just loop that around your garden or your plants. Or you can get something like on the bottom right, more of a drip tape, where you're setting up emitters to individual plants. It's going to be a little more expensive, but again, you're delivering that water directly to those plants. And you do need to inspect these occasionally to make sure they're working properly. None of the emitters have popped out. There's no holes in there. Again, you can see that on the picture on the bottom right. You can see something's going on there real close to that main line that's nice and wet, but further down the line there's no water getting out, so there's probably some kind of blockage in those lines somewhere. So once you've kind of decided what type of garden you're going to grow, kind of start thinking about that plan. So sketch out what you want that garden to look like. So get some graph paper, draw that garden to scale. So whether that each square is a foot, if you're going to have a real big garden, is 6 inches, draw that to scale, and then you can use that to help decide what you're going to put where and space everything out properly. So when it comes to your plant selection, so when you're building your plan, you start thinking about what kind of plants you want to grow. So again, if you're new to gardening, I would encourage you to start with some of our easy to grow vegetables, stuff like lettuce, peas, green beans, cucumbers. If you're going to grow tomatoes, I would look more at the cherry tomatoes. Those tend to have fewer issues than some of our larger types. Um, Another thing to consider is, what do you want to eat? What does your family want to eat? It doesn't make sense to grow tomatoes if nobody in your family likes tomatoes and you're not going to eat them. So don't kind of waste your time on growing stuff that you don't want and you're not going to eat. So you get into that. Plant what you can care for and care for what you plant. So don't grow so much that you can't keep up with it, but then making sure that what you are planting is stuff that you're actually going to utilize. Some things to consider when you're selecting the plants you're going to grow is going to be disease resistance. Again, if you're new to gardening, um, I would encourage you to look at plants that have that good disease resistance. A lot of our hybrid type plants are going to have better disease resistance than the heirloom types. So start with the hybrid types, grow those for a year or two, get familiar with those plants, what they're supposed to look like, what they do, and then you can start branching off into the hybrids kind of down the road. Once you become familiar with those plants. Maturity date can be important. Some plants have real long growing seasons. They need long growing seasons. And if you don't get those out soon enough, you may not get a harvest off of them. How big those plants are going to get, how much produce they're going to produce are things to keep in mind as well. And there's all kinds of interesting shapes and colors when it comes to plants. So just for example, in my garden, you know, typically when we think of carrots, we think of orange carrots, but I've got red, purple, yellow, and white carrots growing. We grow purple potatoes. I've got 3 young kids, so we try to do some different, more colorful type vegetables and stuff to kind of keep them interested in gardening. Um, so when you're thinking about this, go through the seed catalogs, websites, kind of compare different sites, what they have available, and kind of look at the descriptions. Do they list any disease resistance? How long does it take to get a harvest off of them? Stuff like that. Kind of compare that stuff with each other and kind of pick stuff that you think you would like and is going to do well with where you're at. Extension.illinois.edu/veg guide. This is a vegetable gardening guide. Gets into some of that information, as well as vegetable gardening in the Midwest. That's that book in that top right corner there. Those are 2 good resources to get some of that information. There's also the Watch Your Garden Grow website from University of Illinois Extension, goes into some of this stuff as well on individual types of plants. So just for an example here, here's some tomatoes. So you can see these are some of the recommended varieties for Illinois. So we've got these broken up into are they early, are they main crop, are they paste tomatoes, or container tomatoes, what have you. Again, we have that days to harvest. So you can see here um, we've got our Tiny Tim. Hopefully you can see my mouse here. Days to harvest is 45 days. So you put that outside within 45 days, you should have a harvest off your tomatoes, whereas something like Beef Master is going to take 81 days. So if you get a late start to the year, you don't have your tomatoes out until June sometime, kind of late June, you probably want to look at a quicker maturing variety than a longer maturing variety. You can also see here we have a column for resistance. So these different letters stand for different diseases that these types of plants are resistant to. So V is going to be verticillium, F is for fusarium wilt, N is nematodes, T is tobacco mosaic virus, A is alternaria. These are some common diseases we see in tomatoes. So again, if you're new to gardening, I would look for stuff that's got resistance to at least a couple of these different diseases, and that kind of helps you avoid some problems in a lot of cases right off the bat. Again, as you get more experience, you can get into some of the more heirloom types that a lot of times don't have as much disease resistance. And I mentioned this several times, but the size of your garden is also going to dictate what can be planted. So on the bottom pictures here on the left, in the foreground of that picture, growing over that fence, that's kind of our typical yellow crookneck squash. So again, you can see that it requires a lot of room in order to grow that. But down the right, there are some bush varieties of that crookneck squash. So if you want to grow squash and you don't have a lot of space, you want to look for more of those compact or bush varieties of those vegetables. They're going to take up less room. You can also look into interplanting, succession planting, and trellising and staking your plants. That's going to help make much more efficient use of limited space in gardens. And I'll talk about some of those in a couple slides, how that works. So then when it comes to laying out the garden, so when you're actually kind of putting this down on paper, you've picked out what you want to plant, and you're putting it on paper. A lot of times it's a good idea to group crops by maturity. So group plants that they're going to be maturing around the same time, so you're harvesting kind of in one area. You're not having to go all over the garden looking for stuff to pick. It's all kind of concentrated in one area. Um, Arranging crops by height, so you avoid shading shorter crops. So ideally, you're going to be planting our taller crops to the north. Since we're in the northern hemisphere, the sun is always going to be in the south for us. So if you plant your taller crops in the north, that's going to prevent that shading of smaller crops. Also, if you can, maybe a good idea to run your rows east to west again to avoid shading from crops. That's not quite as important as putting the taller crops to the north, though. So just some examples here on plant spacing. So when you're making that plan, figuring out how many plants you can fit in a particular area. So we'll use lettuce as an example here. So lettuce is a plant you would start in the garden from seed. You direct seed that. So typically we're going to put 10 lettuce seeds per row foot. Once those start to germinate, we're going to thin those out to 2 to 4 inches between the plants, and we're going to put our rows 12 to 18 inches apart. So when you're making your plan, kind of incorporate that stuff into your plan so you have an idea of how many seeds you're going to need, how many plants you're going to need in order to plant out your garden. Tomatoes for an example. So this is going to depend on what type of a tomato you're growing, how big it's going to get, but typically we're going to go 18 to 36 inches between plants in a row, and then 36 to 60 inches in between the rows. So again, our large indeterminate types, we're probably looking at that 3-foot spacing in between plants and 5 feet between rows. Some of our smaller, more determinate types, we can probably pack those in a little bit closer. But so all these different types of plants are going to have these different row spacing within rows, and then spacing between rows in there. So pick your plants, decide what that spacing is, or figure out what that spacing is, and then incorporate it into your plan. So some ways you can use your garden space a little more efficiently. So again, that's succession planting. So an example would be after you have a short or cool season crop, you replace those with warm season crops. A lot of times in my garden, I'll grow lettuce. When I'm done harvesting my lettuce, it's about time I would start planting my tomatoes. So I plant my tomatoes where my lettuce were, and I get two crops off of that same area of the garden. Interplanting is kind of the same idea. So again, our later planted or slow maturing crops can be planted between the rows of our short season crops, so that as those larger plants start to mature, our short season crops are done producing, we've harvested them, and then those larger plants are starting to grow and they would be starting to fill in those areas. So again, do that with, again, lettuce and tomatoes, or lettuce um, and potatoes, stuff like that. Again, kind of growing those two crops in the same area to make more efficient use of your space. And staking and trellising is another good thing. Again, for our cucurbits, our tomatoes, stuff like that, some of our larger plants that like to wander. If you grow those up on stakes or poles or trellises, you can get those up off the ground. A lot of times they can take up a lot less room that way. And again, kind of make a little more efficient use of your space by doing that. So when it comes to putting in your garden, so again, this is going to be for your kind of your in-ground bed. If this has been turf in the past, so you're going to have to go in and remove or kill that turf in some way. So you can physically remove that by digging or rototilling all of that stuff up. You can put mulches down, so put 3-4 inches of mulch down, maybe more, to smother that grass, and then you can plant into that. You can also use herbicides to clear your garden spot. You do want to make sure you read that label. So for this particular product, the label here says for all ornamental flowers, trees, and shrubs can be planted 1 day after application. Lawn grasses, herbs, vegetables, and fruits can be planted 3 days after application. So if you're using this herbicides to clear the ground, make sure you're reading the label and to see how long you have to wait before you can plant into that area. When it comes to planting the garden, so planting your seeds, you want to make sure you're creating a smooth seed bed. So you're going in, you're breaking up that soil, breaking up all those clumps and clods of soil, so it's nice, kind of fine particles in there. So when you're planting your seeds, if you have real large chunks, you can have some issues with getting that good soil contact with those seeds. So the finer the soil is, the better soil contact you're going to have, the better success with germination you're going to get. Kind of once you've loosened up that soil, made it nice and fluffy, you want to avoid walking over that area because that's going to compact all that and you're going to have to start all over again. Um, Whatever plants you're planting, you have that seed packet. That should tell you how deep you need to plant those seeds. Again, how many seeds per row you're going to put in there and the distance between the rows. All that information should be on the seed packet, so make sure you're following that when you're planting that stuff. So go ahead, plant your seeds, tamp that soil down, kind of, so again, so you have that good soil contact with those seeds, and then water lightly, making sure that that area is moist. And then when those seeds start to germinate, those plants start to come up, then you can start backing off on the watering a little bit. But you want to make sure that that area is nice and moist until your plants germinate. If you're going to be growing from transplants, so some of our warm season crops, we're typically going to be growing from transplants, our tomatoes, our peppers, stuff like that. So when you're growing out and you're selecting transplants, if you're going to buy those from a nursery, a garden center, what have you, you want to look for plants with healthy green leaves. If they're yellow or kind of a light green, those are plants you probably want to avoid. They could be diseased, they could be nutrient deficient. There could be a number of different reasons those are off colored, but you want to look for kind of nice, healthy green leaves and avoid the sickly looking ones. It's a good idea to try to tap those plants out of the pot. Look at the roots. Those roots should be nice and white and numerous. If they're brown or they're real sparse, again, you may have some issues in that soil mixture in those roots. So those are plants you probably want to avoid. You also want to do a quick look for any insects in there. Again, if you've got a lot of insects on those, put that plant back, look for another one. You don't want to bring any problems into your landscape. So try to start off with clean plants and avoid some problems right off the bat. Um, if you're buying from a nursery or garden center, most likely the plants are going to be hardened off. But if you've started plants on your own, you want to make sure those plants are hardened off. So you're going to slowly introduce them to the outdoors so they get used to cooler temperatures and more direct sunlight. If you were to take a plant from inside, plant it directly into the ground in full sun, more than likely those plants are going to get burned up and die. So you need to slowly acclimate them to outdoor conditions. When it comes to transplanting, ideally you're going to do this on a cloudy day or in the late afternoon. Transplanting plants, there can be some transplant shock to that as you're damaging the roots. So if it's cloudy or later in the day, they're not going to have to kind of compete with that real intense sun. Let them get established a little bit before they have that. Again, you're going to be digging a hole big enough for that plant's root ball. Some people break them up, some people don't. That's kind of a personal preference, but stick that plant in there, and again, um, compact that soil around that root ball, and again, making sure you're following all the spacing distances that are recommended for that particular plant you're planting. Um, so that's kind of a brief overview of kind of how to set up the garden and plant it. So again, when it comes to actually growing the garden, we're going to have weeds, we're going to have insects, disease show up in the garden. So we'll talk briefly about kind of some basic pest control. Um, so ideally, when we're doing pest management, we're doing integrated pest management or IPM. So this is a comprehensive approach to controlling pests, whether that be our insects or weeds or diseases, what have you, with environmentally and economically sound practices. So a lot of times when it comes to IPM, particularly for insects, we're going to have this large insect population. We're going to use our IPM techniques, and we're going to get that population down to a lower level. We're not necessarily going to completely eliminate it, but we're going to get it down to a level where it's not causing us problems anymore. Um, so our pest management is going to start with scouting. So going out and monitoring your plants, figuring out what is out in your garden, and if it's going to warrant any kind of control. So you can do this by trapping or visual inspection. So go out occasionally in your garden, turn over some leaves, look at your plants. Do they look healthy? Do you see insects feeding on them? Or are there insects on them? Are there spots on the leaves? Kind of go out there, familiarize yourself with what your plants look like. And then you can kind of try to figure out if that's going to be an issue or not. So say you go out in the garden and you see something like this. So you've got some squash plants. The leaves have turned brown. They're all curled up. One of these is frost damage. So that's the picture on the left. Downy mildew is on the right. Frost damage, there's nothing you can do about. You probably put those plants out a little too early. If you got a late frost, the plants got damaged. Downy mildew, on the other hand, is a disease. And there's some things you can do for that, try to kind of prevent that spread throughout your garden. So again, making sure and determining what that problem is going to dictate how you go about addressing that issue. Sometimes it's not a big deal. You don't need to do anything. Other times you are going to have to take some kind of action. So when it comes to our pest management, there's going to be 4 different techniques we're going to use. We have our cultural management. So with this, we're trying to maintain our plant health. So this is we're getting into our right plant in the right place at the right time. So again, if you're doing a soil testing, making sure we have that proper fertility, proper pH. Again, looking for those resistant cultivars to try to avoid some problems right off the bat. So pruning out, you can be pruning out, pruning the canopy of plants to get more airflow through there so you have fewer disease problems. Getting rid of diseased plant material, getting that out of the garden so it doesn't spread. Using mulch to keep down weeds, that also is going to help retain some soil moisture. Water use, so watering when we're getting dry, but cutting back on the watering if we have enough rain. You don't want to be watering too much because that can cause just as many problems as not enough. Crop rotation is going to be part of that cultural management. So planting crops in the same location each year can encourage the buildup of diseases and insects in the soil. So we've got crops that are going to be related to each other. You want to try to rotate those throughout the garden. I realize, a lot of times in a home garden, that's easier said than done. A lot of times we're limited with the amount of space we have, but try to grow. So if you're going to grow tomatoes every year, don't grow your tomatoes in the same spot. Try to move that around the garden as far as you can from where you have previously. So this is just an example of how that could work. So the S is going to be our solanaceous crops. So peppers, tomatoes, eggplant, potato. B is brassica, L is legumes, C is cucurbits. And you can see here on this diagram, you just kind of rotate those around the garden every year. These closely related crops, they share a lot of the same disease and insect issues. So if you can move those around, you can try to kind of prevent or slow down the buildup of some of these diseases and stuff. So again, just some other examples of some of these crops that are related. So our beet root or goosefoot, so beet, Swiss chard, spinach are going to be all closely related. Our cold crops are our brassicas, so again, our cabbage, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, kale, um, stuff like that. Our cucurbits, so cucumbers, gourds, melons, squash, pumpkins, those are all closely related. Our legumes are green beans, peas, lima beans. And then our solanaceous crops are tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, potatoes. Those different plants, again, are all closely related, so you'd want to try to avoid planting those in the same spot every year. We also have our physical and mechanical management strategies. So we're going to try to physically eliminate pests from our garden. So this could be cultivating weeds out of the garden with a hoe or hand pulling weeds, hand picking insect pests off of plants. So if you've got tomatoes and you have tomato hornworm on there, you go off and pick those off of your plants. To get rid of Japanese beetles would be another example of this. Putting up barriers, so you could use something like floating row covers, um, bird fabric or bird netting, stuff like that to put over plants, floating row covers to keep off insects early in the year. Um, if you're using something like those row covers, though, when your plants start to bloom, you're going to have to remove those so they can get pollinated, but you can't put those on there to keep off insect pests for a while. We also have our biological management. So just because you see an insect out in the garden does not necessarily mean it's a bad thing. Um, Less than 1% of all insects are actually considered pests. Most insects are actually beneficial. So with biological control, we're using natural enemies, those beneficial insects, to control some of our pests. So in the top picture there, that reddish mite, that is a predatory mite. The one on the left is a two-spot spider mite, so that is a common pest in our landscape. So just because you see a little mite running around doesn't mean it's going to be a pest. Bottom left there, we have an aphid lion. This is a larva of a lacewing. So these are going to go around and feed on aphids and other small soft-bodied insects. And then on the right, we have our ladybugs or our lady beetles. Both the adults and the larvae of those are going to feed on aphids and other insects. We have our parasites and parasitoids. So in the picture on the top there, that wasp. So these are wasps. These are not the large stinging wasps we typically think of, but these are small, kind of like the size of gnats. On the top there, that wasp is laying an egg inside of an aphid. That egg will hatch. It's going to eat the inside of the aphid and kill it. On the bottom right there, those are the cocoons of wasp on that hornworm caterpillar. So if you grow tomatoes, you may be familiar with this on some of the hornworms we have on those. If you encounter a situation like this with all those little cocoons on there, just leave that caterpillar out in the garden. Those are all going to have wasp emerging from there, and those wasps will go around and attack other caterpillars. On the left, we've got some nematodes. Those little white squiggly things are nematodes. They're coming out of the pupa of that butterfly or that moth. So again, those are in the soil, and those will go around and attack other insects in the soil. And just like humans and plants, insects also have diseases. So you can see all that white fuzzy stuff. That is a fungus that has attacked and infected and killed this caterpillar. So again, you may see some of that stuff showing up in your garden as well. And then we have our chemical. So again, we're managing our pests with pesticides, whether that be insecticides for insects, herbicides for weeds, fungicides for fungus, what have you. When it comes to using our chemicals, we want to make sure we are reading the label. The label is the law. So all of our pesticide labels are going to have this phrase: it is a violation of federal law to use this product in a manner inconsistent with its labeling. So that label is a legal document. You want to make sure you're reading and following all of the label directions. If the crop you want to apply that pesticide to is not on that label, legally you cannot apply that to that crop. So make sure you're reading the label and make sure that the plant that you want to apply that pesticide to is on that label. One last thing here before we finish up: everybody is more than likely going to encounter some weeds in their garden. We have kind of two main types of weeds out there. We have our annual and our perennial weeds. So our annual weeds, their life cycle happens over a year. So our winter annual, those weeds are going to germinate in the fall. They'll kind of survive over the summer or over the winter. They'll resume growth in the spring, and they'll produce flowers and seeds in the summer. Our typical annual weeds, those will germinate in the spring. They'll grow throughout the year, and they'll set seed in the fall. Perennials, they grow their first year. Sometimes they'll flower, sometimes they won't, but they're going to persist from a taproot or some kind of storage structure in the soil. They'll be around forever, basically, unless you unless you eliminate them. So when it comes to weed management, it's important to control them before they produce seeds. If you allow them to produce seeds, then you've got all these hundreds or potentially thousands of seeds released into your soil. They're going to keep germinating over time. That goes for all of our weeds. Um, and if you repeatedly deplete the food reserves of perennial weeds, you're constantly cutting them back. Eventually, you will weaken those plants, um, and you could potentially kill them. So when it comes to weed management in the garden, again, that cultivation, whether that be hoeing or rototilling or hand pulling, somehow physically removing those weeds from a garden, using mulches. So again, will those be organic mulches, like in this picture, shredded leaves, straw, uh, wood chips, something like that, those organic plant-based mulches. There's also synthetic or plastic mulches you can use. That's going to help prevent them from coming up. They're not going to get sunlight. Some of those seeds need sunlight in order to germinate, but you can help keep them down that way. Herbicides would be another option, but a lot of times there's not a lot of herbicides that you can use in a kind of a vegetable garden setting. So again, making sure you're reading that label and seeing if you can actually use those herbicides in a garden setting. But more than likely, to get real good weed control, you're going to have to use several different methods in order to be successful. So going out and hand pulling and mulching. So I mulch my vegetable garden. Typically, when we start getting into late summer, that mulch is starting to break down some and weeds are starting to poke through. So I have to go through and hand weed that, but I don't have to do nearly as much weeding as I would if I didn't put any kind of mulch down. So use a couple different techniques and your weed management should become a little bit easier for you. Um, so with that, that's kind of all I have for this. Um, so eventually this will be put up on our Illinois Extension Horticulture YouTube page. And there's also all the our past 4 season recordings are also up on that website. So again, there's one on straw-bale gardening. If you're interested in that, you can check that out. There's some on cover crops and how you can use those in vegetable gardens as well. We do have some more 4 seasons coming up. I believe the next one is colorful vegetables next week. So you can go to go.illinois.edu/4seasons if you want to register for that. There is my contact info if you have any questions. Um, Feel free to send me an email. I'm not in the office, so you can call, but it may be a while before I get back to you. So if you have any questions, send me an email. I'll be happy to try to help you out.